Most people have heard the legend of the apple that fell on Isaac Newton's head and led him to determine how gravity affects the motions of objects in the universe. What most people don't understand is, while that is most assuredly not a true story, its origins do play a role in what we understand today. So if we transport ourselves back in time, we will find there was a point where humans didn't know why celestial bodies, such as planets and moons, orbited in the patterns that they did. There seemed to be no direct connection between any of these bodies, and therefore no real explanation to explain their motion throughout the cosmos. Now, all across London at this time, at coffee shops throughout the cities, prominent scientists of the day would get together and they would bounce ideas and run theories by one another. And on one particular day, the topic of the motion of the heavens was at play. And they discussed back and forth, tried to figure out what could possibly be the cause. And one day they ultimately decided, let's have a contest. They basically crowdsourced in the earliest phases of history. So what they wound up doing is they wound up making a proclamation and saying, anyone and everyone that wants to take a shot at this, if you think you can determine and you can explain why the planets and the moons orbit in the ways in which they do, there is a prize reward. See the bottom hashtag pounded out? That's like pounds, like British pounds, because it's like money. You guys get it? You guys get it? It's funny because like pound money, like British. Okay, anyway. So anyway, they have this contest and they throw that out there and they say, well, let's see who figured this out. And they wait. And they wait. And they wait. And they don't receive any responses that can verify or determine what's going on in the cosmos. So in a last-ditch effort, they hear the name of this young scientist, kind of up and coming, up in Cambridge University. Kind of a loner, really sticks to himself, but fairly bright, as word has it. So why not go up and just throw this idea at him? So one of them goes up, knocks on the door of the dorm room of the student at Cambridge University, and who opens the door but, of course, a young Isaac Newton. At the time, not the scientist that we know today. He's probably about 20, 21, and he hears about this contest and the quest to determine the motion of the cosmos. And as he hears this, he turns to his desk, which is full of papers, and says, give me a couple minutes, I have that here somewhere. And the man goes, what do you mean you have that here? And Newton says, well, I figured this out about 3 or 4 years ago. I have it here somewhere. Give me a few minutes to find it. So the man's floored. At this point, Isaac Newton, this 19, 20-year-old young Cambridge student, is allegedly claiming that he discovered the reason behind the motion of these objects. And it's been lying on his desk for 3 years. So he looks around some more, can't find it anywhere. Tells the man, come back in about 3 or 4 weeks. I'll figure it out again. I'll rewrite the paper. So dumbfounded, the man leaves, trying to figure out how this young student could have figured this out years ago. And it's just been sitting on his desk. Anyway, about 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, the man returns, and Isaac Newton hands him what is known as the Principia Mathematica, which to this day is still considered probably one of the greatest scientific accomplishments. All right, ironically, it's also available on Amazon for $15.95, so I guess that shows you how far we've come. It's the Latin version, so maybe that's why it's $15.95. But anyway, I digress. I just find that fascinating. All right, to go back into this story, though, enter at this point Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke was essentially the Isaac Newton of his time. He was the rock star of physicists and philosophers and scientists. He is known for discovering Hooke's law. He is known for looking at pieces of cork through a microscope and coining the term cells. All right, he has all these accomplishments. He is revered among the scientific community. You may also be wondering why I drew him the way that I did. And that's because no portrait of Robert Hooke exists. There's only written descriptions, and by all accounts, he was the most hideous, the meanest, the ugliest human being to possibly have ever been born. Now, it's interesting that the description is so focused and so detail-oriented on how ugly and how mean he was. But we'll get to that in a second. Robert Hooke, as we said, discovers a lot of what we know about biology, physics, and science today. He's even, at the time, a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, a very premier society. And he hears of this Principia Mathematica. He's very upset. He comes right out and says, "This is ridiculous. Isaac Newton stole that from me. That is my work." Now, this is like a famous superstar accusing some nobody of taking his work. People tend to believe Robert Hooke. They don't know who Isaac Newton is for the most part. So the man that went to talk to Newton has an issue. He has a problem. How does he determine who actually wrote this? So he holds on to the Principia Mathematica, and he says to Robert Hooke, who's at this point slandering Isaac Newton, he says, "I'll give you 3 months. If you can hand me this paper and I can compare it, and you can republish the Principia Mathematica in 3 months, I'll know that you did this work and you will get the credit." 3 months go by, Robert Hooke needs an extension. Says, "Fine, take another 3 months." Another 3 months go by. Robert Hooke says, "I need another couple months." So they give him 3 more months, and after about 9 months, he can't produce any of this. And at this point, it is blatantly obvious that Isaac Newton himself came up with this theory, and this is really the point at which Isaac Newton and his credibility and his fame begin to take off, and he starts to become the scientist, the physicist that we know and love today. He becomes so famous for a lot of his discoveries that he even becomes eventually the president of the Royal Academy of Sciences. And as a member of the Royal Academy of the Sciences, you'll notice in this room there's plenty of portraits around, and that's because if you're the president, if you're the member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, you get a nice portrait painted of yourself and hung in the hall. This is a premier society. So Isaac Newton gets his portrait on the wall, he overcomes those early attempts to slander him, and everybody lives happily ever after. Except that I'm kidding, of course that doesn't happen. If you've been paying very careful attention, you may have noticed a discrepancy in the story. We don't really know what Robert Hooke looked like because no portrait exists. But he was a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, and much like Isaac Newton, he also had his portrait painted. So the question now becomes, what happened to the portrait of Robert Hooke that once hung in the halls of the Royal Academy of Sciences? And according to legend, as president, decades later, Isaac Newton, likely having consumed a little bit too much alcohol, sitting by the fire, looks up and sees the portrait of Robert Hooke, his rival, the man who tried to slander him when he was in the early stages of his career. And according to the legend, he picks the portrait off the wall, throws it into the fire, erasing any visual history of Robert Hooke. I'm going to go so far as to say that all these descriptions, these detailed descriptions about how ugly, how mean he was, are very likely also the doing of Isaac Newton, who effectively erased his rival from history as best he could. And he sat there, and he just enjoyed watching Robert Hooke burn out of existence, knowing full well that he had the final say. And that is where the famous expression that absolutely no one has heard of comes from. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, there's savage. You can look around your daily life, you can read the news, you can see plenty of examples of things that are savage. And then there's savage like Newton. Savage like Newton, effectively erasing a human being from history. I don't know if it gets more savage than that. But it also begs the question, the apple itself may be a myth. But what about the portrait? And in case you're wondering, yes, this shirt is phenomenal. And yes, I do make it look very good. And for only 6 easy payments of $499.99, you too can be on fleek. Hashtag I see you. Did I use either of those correctly? No? All right, well, we'll try again tomorrow.